So welcome. Welcome everyone who is here with us on Zoom, anyone who is with us on Facebook. We are so glad that you are here to join us for this really special session. We've been doing wonderful learning over the last couple weeks, but I'm really delighted to be able to introduce our guest speaker for today. Rabbi Josh Weinberg serves as the Vice President of the URJ for Israel and Reform Zionism and is the Executive Director of ARTZA, the Association of Reform Zionists of America. He was ordained from HUC-JIR Israeli Rabbinic Program in Jerusalem and currently lives in New York. Josh previously served as the director of the Israel program for the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College and as a faculty member for Nifty EIE High School in Israel, teaching Jewish history. Josh is a reserve officer in the IDF spokesperson's unit and has hiked the Israel Trail and came on Aliyah to Israel in 2003. He is originally from Chicago. He graduated from University of Wisconsin and has an MA from the Hebrew University in Jewish Education. He is passionate about anything connected to Israel and hopes to strengthen the connection between the Reform movement and the Jewish state. And that's a little bit more about what we are going to hear more about today. So Josh, I am going to hand it over to you. I am going to spotlight you so people can see where you are. And really, thank you so much for making the time to join us today. We're so happy to have you here and to be able to learn with you.
Well, thank you, Ariana. And if I unspotlight myself, does that change it for everyone else?
Nope, I think you can do it, and then you can see everyone, but we still get to see you.
Too much of that. Okay. Well, listen, Ariana, it's really wonderful. Rabbi Gordon, it's really wonderful to be with you and with Temple Israel in West Bloomfield. It's I always enjoy my time with you and your congregation and your clergy team, and over the years I've become good friends, and I was even there thinking about it just 51 weeks ago, just about a year ago. I spent Shabbat with you in Detroit. Those who thought that it was a good idea to come to Detroit in February, not sure who that was, but it was it was a great time inside. And I just want to thank you at Temple Israel for all of your support. I really mean that. I know how important Israel is to Temple Israel, and that manifests itself in so many different ways. You take hundreds of people to Israel all the time, and it's a robust program throughout everything that you do. And the efforts that you made just about a year ago for the World Zionist Congress elections. How many people voted in that? Anybody? Okay. Oh, so you're the ones. Okay, great. It really does. It really did make a difference. And it's wonderful to be with you. And I just want to say how impressed I am by holding a festival of Jewish learning over this week. I want to put a pin in that. I want to keep that on our radar screen because it's something I'm going to make reference to when we look at one particular diaspora community and what that means. And you're kind of reviving this ancient tradition of coming together for a week of learning. And it's really wonderful. And I'll just give a shout out to some people that I see who I know are not necessarily Temple Israel in Detroit and are coming to us with the advantage of technology that geography doesn't matter anymore. So it's nice to see you like Liz and Shirley and Deb Spector and coming. And for those of you who with your cameras off and you would like to turn on your camera and you feel comfortable, it's always nice to learn face to face with one another. So with that, I want to begin, and really feel free to make this as interactive as possible and to put comments in the chat or to raise your hand or to unmute and shout out. And if you have comments on the old book of faces over there that you're watching, maybe Ariana, if you're seeing that, then feel free to chime in there too. We are pluralistic, so all modes of technology and devices are welcome. The topic that we're discussing right now, the question of Israel-diaspora relations, is something that not only do I have a great interest in sort of as an academic venture or like a textual-based understanding, but it's something that's very close to my heart, and I feel like I live it every day. And I think that it's something that we have to explore really in every generation as circumstances change, historical events change, and our Jewish community continues to evolve and grow, and the relationships also change. You know, I was thinking about my grandparents, both of them, Aleichem Shalom, as we say. May their memories be for a blessing. But you know, at their 60th wedding anniversary, they both said, you know, no, neither of us, one another, is not the same person that we were when we got married 60 years ago. And it was interesting to think, of course they're not. You know, you are who you are, and you grow and you evolve, and the question is, how do you relate to one another, and as you grow and evolve, and how do things change? And so I want to use that metaphor. There's lots of metaphors that we can use, but the family metaphor, whether you know, a marriage metaphor, about the Israel and diaspora relationship. But what I want to do is I want to take about 5, 6, or 7 minutes, and I want to establish the narrative. How do we understand? So first of all, let's just understand how many of you spent time in Israel before? Okay. How many of you are what we would call repeat offenders, and that you go back, you've been several times? Okay. How many people haven't been in a while, like more than 10 years? Okay, some of you, yeah, Joey, Bob, good to see you, right? How many people go like I have an aunt who says it's not galut if you commute, right? It's not exile if you commute. It rhymes in Hebrew, but you know that we go back and forth all the time. Anybody on the, maybe in the pre-pandemic times, you know, feel like you go 3-4 times a year. That's how I you know, operate a little bit. I'm fortunate to be able to do that. And so I want us to think about how we've seen Israel change over time, as you know, we've been, you know, going back and forth, and how we see the American Jewish community change in our relationship with Israel. And I think that also as a result of a global pandemic, the relationship has changed and evolved even more, because geography matters less, and it's in some cases easier through technology to bring and bridge the gaps between these two people. Although I would still maintain that being on Zoom is not the same as being in person. And I hope, as we say in feminist Hebrew, in Tirza Hashem, one day we will be able to get back to Israel and to start commuting again, as it were. I'm okay not commuting to the office, but I'd like to commute to Israel, as I say. So let's establish the narrative. What is the classic narrative of the diaspora and our relationship with Israel? I'm going to take us even back to biblical times to try to set it up, and we're going to see how Israel viewed this. And then what I want to do is look at a few different models that have evolved over time, and to suggest our own model. That's a lot to cram into an hour, so we'll see how far we get. First of all, what are some terms that we use? Show of hands, how many of you on a day-to-day basis wake up in the morning and feel yourself as living in a diaspora? What does the term diaspora even mean? I mean, feel free to shout it out or put it in the chat. Anybody think of themselves on an active basis as living in the diaspora?
Well,
Isn't it considered living
so
in exile?
everywhere out. So go ahead, Eric. Yes, sir.
Living in exile.
Oh, so exile's a different term than diaspora. Are they synonymous? If we had a Venn diagram, right, there might be some overlap there, not entirely synonymous. Let's get to exile in a second. Good. Diaspora, someone wrote in not Israel, right? And if you look, or not living in Israel, right? If you ask Israelis to, you know, determine, you know, what are the two places in the world, they say, oh, that's very easy. There's Israel, and there's everywhere else. You know, there's chul, as we say, chutz la'aretz in Hebrew, you know, outside of Israel. Okay, let's break down the etymology for a second. The word diaspora actually, right, or being no center, right? We're sort of out there. Okay, interesting. The diaspora come from the term dispersion, like we have been dispersed from somewhere, okay? How many of you were born in the United States? How many of your parents were born in the United States? Okay, wow, okay, that's already, if we'd have asked this question 50 years ago, many of us might have been first generation. How many of you are your parents first generation? Yeah, okay, so we come to, so we weren't physically dispersed anywhere. I even asked my Orthodox questions, this Orthodox friends this question, right? I said, tell me something, do you live in exile or the diaspora? I'll get to exile in a second. And they say, well, of course, we say it in our prayers every morning, right? And we say in the Amidah, and we've ingathered the exiles from the four corners of the earth. And I say, I know what you say in the Siddur, in the prayer book, but do you yourself actually feel like you're living in exile? And someone put in the comment, yes, especially during the Christmas season, during the non-Jewish holiday season. I can totally identify with that, absolutely. And my Orthodox sometimes friends, look at it and say, well, we live in Long Island, that's not exactly exile, or we live in West Bloomfield, where there are lots of Jews. And I say, oh, that it's fascinating to say when you live where there's a very strong, close Jewish community, okay, then you don't necessarily feel, if you lived in Montana, Wyoming, or something like that, you may feel that a little bit differently. What does the word exile mean? In Hebrew, we use the word galut or golah as the state of being exiled. What's the intonation there? What are we inferring with that word? Where does it come from? What do we think?
That you were kicked out of the country.
Yeah, absolutely, Maxine Yefemo would write exactly that something was done to us. We were forcibly removed from our space into somewhere else that is outside of our own, whether called country, state, existence, right? And that is the word that is used. And the ancient rabbis really couldn't fathom a concept in which it would be possible to return to into the land of Israel, but people would actively choose not to. And I think this goes to the American discussion a little bit. And by American, I mean North American also, about how we see ourselves. So let's set up the narrative briefly so that we're all on the same page. And I'll just put up just a few slides so you can see. Here's when we talk about the Jewish diaspora. Any Yiddish speakers here? Did you ever learn that phrase in Yiddish where they say, "Oh, how long were you waiting in line at the supermarket or at something?" And people would say, "Oh, as long as the Yiddish Galus." They say, "We were waiting as long, as the Jewish exile." People say, it's a long time. It's been a long time in coming. So what's the narrative? Essentially, let's remember that in ancient times we had two, in fact, kingdoms, right? The northern kingdom called Israel and the southern kingdom called Judea or Yehuda, and they split in the year 722. It should say BCE, not BCE, not BC. We say before the Common Era. Okay, and it fell to the Assyrians. We called out those the 10 lost tribes. They were then dispersed. Okay, and what happens in the year 586? Also should say BCE. Right, the Babylonians conquered the city of Jerusalem and destroyed the temple, the Beit HaMikdash that stood in Jerusalem, and forcibly exiled all of the people living there. Anybody know what date this happened on in the Hebrew calendar? Feel free to shout it out or to
Tisha B'Av.
right, Tisha, and the 9th day of the month of Av. Of course, if you look in the book of Kings, it does say the 10th day of the month of Av, but let's not mess with tradition here for a second, right? And that becomes, of course, the fateful date in which we mourn the destructions of both temples. Now we set up that was the sort of the MO of ancient kingdoms. How do you conquer a kingdom and sort of subjugate and and integrate or assimilate the other nations, the other people, well, you disperse them out throughout your kingdom. And so that's what happened. And people, the Jews were sent to Babylon. And that's where we, of course, the famous verses from Psalm 137, where it says, Al Na'arot Bavel Sham Yashavnu Gam Bachinu B'Zachenu Tzion, like by the rivers of Babylon, we lay down and wept when we remembered Zion. And that is a very strong memory for us. Okay, and so what happens? Of course, we know 50 years later, Cyrus comes along and it allows us, King Cyrus comes along and allows us to return. Okay, or the Jews of Israel and Jew were exiled to Mesopotamia or to Babylon, and that begins this Jewish diaspora. And we were able to return in 538, 536, depending on who you asked. Did everyone go back automatically? What do you think?
No.
No, a lot of people said, life is really good here on the banks of the Tigris and the Euphrates or the Hudson or the Lake Michigan or wherever, and we're just going to stay here and hang on. And that built up one of the strongest Jewish communities outside of the land of Israel at the time. Okay, so they returned, but a number of people did return. And here, if you look at the end of the Bible, right, the end of the Tanakh, you see these two books, Ezra and Nehemiah. They talk all about that return. It's called Shivat Zion in Hebrew. And they talk about the return and they try to rebuild. Then what happens? It lasts for a good 400 or 500 years, only to be destroyed, foreign rule to come again, Greeks, then the Romans, and then the temple is going to be destroyed. We remember the whole Hanukkah story. I'm not going to spend time on it now, right? Roman rule comes about. This is like, standing on one foot. King Herod builds the second temple, and then it gets destroyed in the year 70. Anybody remember the date that happened on the year 70? Trick question, right? Of course.
Yet again,
the 9th of Av, it gets destroyed. But what really happened is much more. I want us to understand the destruction of the temple here, not just as a physical structure being demolished, right? The burning of a building, let's say, but really the destruction of a whole society. We call that churban in Hebrew. That's a Hebrew churban. And by the way, when Yiddish speakers referred to the Holocaust, they also used the same word. In Yiddish, they said churban, churban, which meant a churban, a total destruction of society in which people were, not only our central institution was destroyed, but everyone was kicked out and exiled. You see that famous, it's not really a statue, it's more of like a stone, there's a word for it in art that I just don't know. A depiction of people carrying out the artifacts and the religious items used in the ritual items used in the temple. There's the menorah, and this is also the picture that's depicted on the Arch of Titus in Rome. So let me just look in the chat. Any comments? Okay, I can't see it. Yeah. So right. A frieze. Thank you. Yeah, in stone. Very good. Okay, so that is the notion that we were now exiled from our land, and that exile, of course, according to our narrative, is going to last now for 2,000 years. Okay, and we look, back at the remnants of the temple that was destroyed there, and we can see it being, right, a relief. That's also what I'm looking for. Thank you. But I just want you to know that there was another in 135, that should say CE of the Common Era. That's really when the end of another revolt called the Bar Kokhba revolt, which took place from 132 to 135. And tens of thousands of people were killed. I'm not going to get into it, but really then that's when the Jews were exiled and kicked out of the land. Now we have to talk about survival. How did Judaism change there? Well, really Torah study, Talmud study, and really after the exile, and again, I'm simplifying things, we created the Talmud, and really we saw now the central institution become the synagogue. And here I want to be self-critical for a moment of our own movement, that I don't think that the words synagogue and temple are synonymous. Okay, they actually mean different things. In the Reform movement, we replaced synagogues with the concept of temple. In what does synagogue mean, by the way, in English? How do we translate? That's a Greek word, synagoga. I'll give it to you in Hebrew. We say Beit Knesset. What is it? What does it mean in English?
House of meeting.
Mm-hmm. Exactly, house of gathering, right? We know the word Knesset from Israel. That what does Knesset mean in Israeli politics? And don't say a place where everyone argues and yells and screams at each other, right? But
The parliament.
Seat of
Parliament,
government.
exactly, where people come together. By the way, it all comes from the same similar word. Just if you're a grammar person or you like to have fun with these things, I'll stop for a second. We have the word Knesset in Hebrew. How do we say church? I know the word is knessia.
Oh,
Okay, from the same root. Any Spanish speakers here? How do you say church in Spanish?
iglesia.
Iglesia. So where does that come from? Right. Think about a Latin word that we know from our own Torah. We read a book on Sukkot. Actually, we call the book of Ecclesiastes.
Mm-hmm.
Iglesia, Ecclesiastes is the same root word in the Latin. Okay, in the Latin and the Greek. In Hebrew, we call that kohelet, which is the same root as the word kihila for community or coming together. So all these things have nothing to do with religiosity or theology or holiness, but really where we come together, gathering, almost like a community center. And how do we say temple in Hebrew, by the way? The word in Hebrew is Beit Mikdash. There are two words, right? The word Mikdash. What shorish? Anybody tease out the root there of the word? Kuf Dalid Shin.
Kadesh.
Yeah, or we say, here, I'm going to put it in the chat for you if I can type for a second. Here's the root word of it, right? And we have, in English, we would say Kodesh, right? That something is holy, right? And we use it all the time, Kiddush, Kaddish, right? All of these things that we use, is holy. So I might even translate the word Beit Mikdash as a temple or like a shrine almost, which is really very much based on, theology and ritual and things that have to happen there. So that's my own shtick, I'll say, or mishigas that I have with using the words temple versus synagogue. And it's a fascinating, the evolution in the history of the Reform movement of how that entered parlance to be synonymous almost with synagogue. But so that's the classic narrative. Okay, we were from the land of Israel, our temple was destroyed, and we were exiled out of the land, only to return when? And here I'll show you, let's look at the classic Zionist narrative for a second. Okay, and let's see. Uh-oh. Here we go. My computer's being funny. Sorry, apologies. 1 second, I'm just going to share. Okay. Apologies, 1 moment there. Aha, okay. Give it a second to come up. Can you see that? Just yes, can you see the screen that says, what is the Zionist narrative? Yes, okay. So what is the Zionist narrative? And the Zionist narrative is laid out very, very clearly for us in the foundational document of the State of Israel, none other than the Declaration of Independence, or what we call in Hebrew, the Scroll of Independence. And I won't make you read that blurry, small Hebrew print for a second. Okay, but let's see what it says here in the next slide. Here it is in English. Anybody want to give a read for the first stanza, the first sentence? Do we have a volunteer? This is a text study. Yeah, Anita, please. Yeah.
The land of Israel was the birthplace of the Jewish people. Here, their spiritual, religious, and political identity was shaped. Here, they first attained to statehood, created cultural values of national and universal significance, and gave to the world the eternal book of books.
Okay, thank you. Fascinating way to open our declaration of declaring the independence of our modern political sovereign entity, right? Okay, what are we saying about ourselves? Right, that everything happened right here in the land of Israel. And this is, by the way, if we want to be a little bit critical, okay, just this is the Zionist movement, which I affirm personally affirm myself strongly at the center of, right? I am identified with the Zionist movement very much, but this is the sort of the building and the development of the Zionist narrative for us to understand what story is it telling us about, and does anybody see any problems or any issues with with the story that we tell ourselves about ourselves? And well, let me ask you a question. Where was the book of books given to us?
In the wilderness. And wasn't Abraham in Iraq?
Okay, all right. So if was our spiritual and religious political identity born in Israel? Okay, you could make a case for it. You could also make a case not for it. And here I'm not going to go way into archaeology and biblical source critical theory. If you're into that kind of thing as a reference, I would recommend a few books. One of them being Richard Elliott Friedman's book on the Exodus. Okay, and it also fits in nicely with the Torah portions that we're reading this month and around time leading up to Pesach. He gets into that from an academic point of view. But as Deb said, look, the Torah was the Torah given in the land of Israel, the book of books? It was not, right? It was given in Sinai, outside. Judaism as we know it today would not be what it is without the Talmud, right? Where is the Talmud developed?
Babylonia.
In Babylonia. That's the one that won out, right? There
Right.
are two Talmuds, of course, that we know, right? And there's this thing. So what is the narrative trying to say? Anybody want to read the next stanza there? Or Anita, you want to keep going?
Sure. After being forcibly exiled from their land, the people kept faith with it throughout their dispersion and never ceased to pray and hope for their return to it and for the restoration in it of their political freedom.
Okay, so as if it's designed to say, we were kicked out of our land and we every day got up in the morning to pray. And by the way, that is true. If we look at the place of Israel in our liturgy, right, in our tefillah, in our siddur, okay, first of all, which direction do we face? By the way, we're always facing towards, for us in North America, we face east, generally speaking, and we face towards Israel. And I love it. Even at Temple Israel, you have, when you're sitting in your sanctuary, you have a very vivid image of that, of the Aron HaBrit, right, of the Mishkan, right? Isn't that what it is, or the temple, the image that you see of your ark? If I'm not mistaken, is that the case, right? Right, Gordon, your ark is in the shape of the tabernacle, or the yes, no, maybe. Okay, right. So it's right there, present for us, and we say it at everything, at the end of Yom Kippur, at the end of our Pesach Seder, at the end of it is woven into the grace after meals that we say when we eat every day, right? It's a part of who we are, so we maintain that. And I'm not going to go through the whole declaration. By the way, if you haven't read it, it's 19 short paragraphs. Take a look at it. Ben Gurion wanted it to be part of the Jewish canon of sacred texts. Okay, and it was written on parchment by a scribe. Okay, I'm always fascinated. Yeah, right. Okay, it is like the Mishkan, right? And so I think it's really an amazing Jewish statement to say that about recreating modern, traditional modes in the modern world. So what is this Israel-centric narrative? And it is exactly that Israel is in the center of the world. And look at these medieval maps, who, at the time they thought they were very accurate, but now we can look at it as a metaphor almost, right? How many of you seen these maps of Jerusalem before, where there it is, Jerusalem is in the center of the world, quite literally. We saw at the cross, the cross section of ancient civilizations coming together with Europe, Africa, and Asia. And there it is, the land of Israel, Jerusalem, right in the middle. And the Israeli sort of Zionist narrative really built off of that very much, in that we had this narrative that, right, some people make posters of New York, or if you read the magazine, The New Yorker, they once had a cover like that, where New York is here, California is there, and everything is some sort of confused mishmash of in between, right? And those of us who live in the Midwest or grew up in the Midwest, we know that there is actually other stuff out there. Hey, and that's actually an interesting question. What about those who do not live in Israel? Do we live in the periphery? Do we live in in the diaspora, or in the exile, in the area outside of Israel? And this developed into an early Zionist and early Israeli notion. I'll give it to you in Hebrew and then I'll translate for you. Just because I want to you hear it. They would call this Shlilat HaGola, or the negation of, or the rejection of the diaspora. Okay, and for someone to be an exilic Jew was really a pejorative, really an insult to people. And here, we need a lot more discussion on what Zionism tried to do and attempted to do. But really, that notion is only now starting to change, okay? And some of us remember that, wait a second, remember that Babylonian exile that we looked at? Well, there was a different model in which there were two centers of Jewish life. Okay. Now, sometimes I wish that the United States would be as close to Israel as Babylonia was. Okay. And it would be a 2-hour flight rather than a 12-hour flight. And we could go back and forth with great ease. And living in Israel all these years, I really was jealous of my friends who came from Europe, whose family could come and visit for a weekend a lot easier than my parents could from Chicago. But you get it. But that was an important notion, and we know of stories in the Talmud where people went back and forth. There's a character named Ula in the Talmud who says, Ula ikla the Ard Yisrael. He would always go up and back and forth to Israel. And what do we say? But what's the narrative that remains for us? That's much part of the Israeli narrative. What do we say when we take out the Torah from the Ark? I'll give you a hint. It starts with the word ki in Hebrew. I'm being subtle as a brick here.
Ki mitzion tetzei Torah.
Right, we say ki mitzion tetzei Torah. Right, here it is. We stand there in the diaspora, right, in our communities everywhere around the world, whether doesn't matter what movement you're in or how you affiliate, we all say this, that from out of Zion, from out of Israel, come Torah and the word of God from Jerusalem. Right, that's what we say. We sort of as almost as an affirmation in front of everybody. But I'll just share with you that I found an obscure text, and I didn't put it up on a slide. I found an obscure text that said, "Ki mi Bavel tetzei Zion." This is an ancient rabbinic text that said, actually, from Babylon came Torah. And the early Reform movement people rewrote it to say "Ki me Cincinnati tetzei Torah." I'm joking, but that was almost that, but not joking, entirely. is that was the notion that we replaced the center, we replaced the notion of Israel with wherever we happen to be living, whether it was Germany, Amsterdam, or the United States. And I want to foreshadow the punchline here in that we have a different kind of a model. And the philosopher Shimon Ravidovich, who I'll introduce in a second, offered to say, wait a second, why don't we today in the modern world, he was a 20th century guy, and I think it applies to the 21st century. Why don't we look also at the same model to say, just like in Israel and Bavel, rather than it being, and I'll share with you another sort of Israel-centered, and if you can imagine now a bicycle wheel with a center and spokes going out, we call those holy spokes, right? Spokes going out to far-fledged communities. Diaspora, Rabbi Dovich comes in and says, wait a second, and we're going to look at him in a minute. Let's look at a different model, and that is the model of an ellipse rather than a circle. And the ellipse has two, people say foci. I actually looked this up. The correct grammar for the plural of focus is actually focuses. So two focuses being Israel and diaspora. Okay, now this is radical. Yeah, it's a good question about Israel and the Constitution. I'll get to it in a second. This is a radical notion, especially for challenging the diaspora narrative. Okay, and Rabbi Dovich is a complicated figure. I'll tell more about him in a second. We'll look at one of his texts. To suggest that actually the diaspora and Israel, or maybe we should say world Jewry and Israel, are on equal footing. Whoa, wait a second. Ouch. And I'll flesh this out. Were any of you present at the Union for Reform Judaism's biennial convention? Liz is already raising her hand before I say what year it was. Is in 2017. It took place in Boston, which is a city just outside of Detroit. I don't know if anyone was there. Ariana, okay, great. And Liz, of course, was there, and maybe some others. The reason I'm bringing that up is that on Shabbat morning, the president of the URJ, Rabbi Rick Jacobs, gave a sermon that was really, it was all about Israel. It was all about our relationship to Israel. And one of the things that he said, or one of the ideas that he shared with us, was that maybe we should stop using the term diaspora because we're not really dispersed. Okay, and there's some hemming and hawing there, and what do we think? And some people applauded loudly. So that evening on Saturday night, I sat with our Israeli delegation. There was about 35 people who had come from Israel, from the reform movement in Israel, to be at the biennial. And this is really like a reverse pilgrimage for them, because wow, they were able to see 5,000 people praying together and all these sessions and concerts, and it's really an amazing experience. And when we went around the circle to debrief and to say, what are you internalizing, what are you dealing with? One person from Israel said, said, listen, we have so much to learn from the North American reform movement, actually. And this is such, it was such an amazing experience of learning and of, meeting people and all of that. But what Rabbi Jacobs said about not using the diaspora, that was hard for me as an Israeli. She said, all my life and going through the Israeli education system, I've been ingrained to think about Israel as the center. And Israel is the center. And what is the job of the diaspora? Go ahead, you fill in the blank. What would be the job of the diaspora, of the Jewish communities in the diaspora? Yeah, Bob, you're onto it. Go ahead, unmute, say it.
Writing checks.
Okay, right. Offering support, right? And And by the way, if we look back at the book of Numbers and Deuteronomy, we already see examples of that. And even in Ezra, when only 10% returned to Israel, they said, "Don't worry, we'll join the appeal. You know, we'll support it." So, and that was it. Okay, and it was, you know, it was this notion of our job is to be Israel and to survive and to be the strong, you know, like think about Ari Ben Kenan from the movie Exodus, not the book in the Torah, the Leon Uris one, okay, of the mythic hero. Our job is to be heroic, and your job is to be Woody Allen and support us. Okay, I don't mean all the gross, inappropriate stuff of Woody Allen. I mean the image of the diaspora Jew, which was Woody, you know, sort of like the Nebuch, we'll call him. That was the image. I want to suggest that it's time to rethink that image and to rethink what we now have to offer. Okay, so I want to shift, and I want to look at some different models. Okay, and they're going to be based on text and based on different ideas, and I'm going to call them up here on my screen and share them. Okay, I always suffer from having too many screens open at one time. And as they say, worse things have happened to the Jewish people. So here we go. Let's look at this. And when I say, you know, is diaspora Zionism, is that a contradiction in terms, right? Well, I don't know, right? We have to check it out. All right, let's look. Can everyone see the screen? Okay. So what was the goal of Zionism? Essentially, of course, to create a sovereign political entity in our ancestral homeland. That is the sort of definition, and that happened. And if you were a Zionist, right, I'm saying, you know, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100 years ago, what would that mean? It means you would join a Zionist movement with the singular hopes of making aliyah, okay, of transporting Jews from here to there, okay, and reestablishing, you know, the center of life in the land of Israel, okay, and after 1948 in the state of Israel. So that's well and good. And that was true for all Zionist movements, whether they're religious or secular, socialist or revisionist or whatever, except for one. Can anybody guess? I'll give you a hint. Yeah, exactly, Bob. Yes, except for American Zionism, right? Where the express goal was not necessarily to make aliyah, okay? And, you know, here's the model of the spokes in the wheel in case you had trouble conjuring up an image of what a bicycle wheel looked like. You know, there it is for you. Yes, and we look at, you know, the old time, you know, American Zionism, where it was to say, okay, we want, and the joke goes that a first party will raise money from a second party to get a third party to go live in Israel. Okay, that's what it was, you know, is people like running around to raise money from others to say, let's go support Israel. And no, we're not exactly going to live there. So let's look at one model. By the way, how many of you who have spent time in Israel, how many of you have met Israelis or have friends who are Israelis or relatives who are Israelis? Okay, and I'll try not to generalize too much, but it's how many of you in Israel at some point have been approached, whether it's by your cousin or your uncle or a taxi driver, and has said, do you like it here in Israel? Okay, and your reply is, oh yes, I love it. I feel wonderful here and everything's beautiful and there's no problems or anything. Okay, I'm just kidding. And they say, okay, so no, why you don't make aliyah? Anybody ever gotten that before? Like, why don't you just move here tomorrow? How many of you are familiar with the Birthright program, Birthright Israel? Okay, maybe you know someone who went, or you yourself, or you've had children or grandchildren who've gone on. So at the first mega event that I went to, this is an event in Israel, they bring all the Birthright groups together. This is in the fall of 2001. And they brought 3,000 18 to 26-year-olds in a big auditorium in Jerusalem, and they're all screaming and yelling and having a great time and really feeling it there. And the Prime Minister of Israel was scheduled to speak to them. His name at the time was Ariel Sharon. And he walks up on stage, with a big building, and we're going to hear from the Prime Minister of Israel. Wow. He walks up on stage and says, I hope you are having a good time in Israel. Everybody screams, and yes. And I hope that you all make Aliyah very soon. Thank you. And walks off the stage. I said, wow, like I got to meet this guy's speechwriter. I mean, this was incredible, and people, they didn't know what to do with it. But I'm looking around at their staff, and saying like, I was actually, I was covering it it was in the fall of 2000. I was covering it as a journalist at the time, and I was like, well, gosh, that's he couldn't have minced words more. It's so blunt. That was the notion, okay. And people are like, okay, thank you. That doesn't speak to me. And I'll share one more anecdote with you if I can, and we'll look at these models. One of my jobs in the Israeli army was to they realized that I was like almost fluent in English, and so they gave me a job at the IDF spokesperson's unit. And I was an old man. I was 28 years old when I went into the army, and that's a story for a different time. But so they sent me to speak to groups of Israeli soldiers who were preparing to meet Birthright groups. Okay, I don't know if you know this. Every bus of Birthright participants had about 7 or 8 Israeli soldiers on the bus for 5 days, not as security, but as an education opportunity, what we call a mifgash, an encounter, for them to meet Jews from the diaspora, from who are their age and cohort. So I was supposed to tell them how to talk about the army, and I quickly realized that they had no idea who they were going to encounter here. They knew nothing about North American Jewry. So I'm sitting there in an auditorium of 200 Israeli soldiers, sitting there listening, all eager to take 5 days off in the army and tour around with North American 18 to 26-year-olds. As you can imagine, the excitement there. And in the end, I posed to them a question. And I asked them the question, I said, why do American Jews live in America? What do you think they answered? Put yourself in the mindset of a 19, 20-year-old Israeli soldier without a PhD in sociology and without, having spent a great deal of time abroad or anything like that. What do you think they said? Feel free to unmute, just throw out, yeah.
Wow.
Sure.
Might have said this is our home.
Not quite. So Israelis, 19, 20-year-olds, like they said, oh, of course. Why do they live in America? Well, you have a big house and you can drive a nice car and your salaries are higher, and there's not as much terrorism there, not much piguim as terrorist attacks, and essentially they said better material life. And I said no, and now I'm being a little bit not nice in what I said. I said that's why Israelis live in America. Okay, again, not nice and a gross generalization. I said, don't think for a second that all American Jews are somehow on the fence of Aliyah. Should we move to Israel? Should we not move to Israel? But you know what? Life is comfortable here, so I'm gonna not move to Israel. I said, especially remember, the Birthright program was designed for those who had never been to Israel before, never had an experience there. So they said, I said, no, American Jews live in America because they are American. Okay? And for many, I would say even most Americans, it doesn't even occur to them to think about moving to Israel, and many of them, hadn't even come to Israel yet until this experience. And so I want you as Israelis to shift your thinking about that, and to think about them as just, sort of materially driven by something, and that, makes their existence. No, it's a very, and they were like, wow, it never even occurred to me that would be the case.
Can
Right?
you,
So there's,
can
yeah,
you
please,
so
yeah.
we can see you?
Oh, yeah. Let me stop. I lost the button. Okay. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, yes. My apologies. Yeah. So that's by way of anecdote to see that here's where we are. And I have 4 models to share with you, but in the interest of time, and I'm happy to send this source sheet to Rabbi Gordon, and we can distribute it to everybody, and we can look at it for further reading. What I do want to share is a little bit about this guy, Ravidovich. I'll just give you his background. He grew up, Shimon Ravidovich is a fascinating character, and so not well known in really anywhere except for in the academy. He came out of the school in Europe at the end of the 19th century with all the intellectual crowd, with Buber and Rosenzweig and Gershom Scholem and all the and was part of the Zionist movement. He was a disciple of a guy called Achad Ha'am, and he's an unparalleled scholar and philosopher, and really incredible. Didn't really take off in Israel. He tried to get an appointment at the Hebrew University in the 30s, and so he left and he landed in the early 1940s in a city called Chicago, where he was part of like the Leo Strauss School at the University of Chicago in the intellectual circles. And then he leaves Chicago in about 1950, 51. He was invited to to establish the Jewish Studies Department at a new university they had created in Boston called Brandeis University. So he goes there and he dies quite young in 1957, but he did publish, was his magnum opus, like a 700-page book in very, very complicated Hebrew called Bavel and Yerushalayim, okay, Babylon and Jerusalem. That book, which is now, by the way, in Hebrew, I think about 17 people have read it, including my teachers, David Ellenson and Michael Narmer, if you've ever learned with them. And just now, a professor from UCLA, a guy called David Myers, has translated most of it. He also published a book on the last chapter, but too much. It's available online if you're interested. I'm happy to send you a PDF of Myers' book, which got published last month. Okay, it's very, very exciting if you get excited by those things. So what was Ravidovich's message? He said, all right, let's look at our existence in the diaspora as an ellipse rather than a circle, and let's look at us on equal footing. And here's the quote. Does anybody want to volunteer just to read that quote that I just put in the chat? If you can, this is an excerpt from some of his writings.
I'll read
I
it.
bring it because I think it's relevant to us today. Yeah, please.
Okay. Two that are one, however, must not be understood as one-sided obligation. Each must mutually recognize the other. The diaspora of Israel must build the state of Israel with all its strength, even more than it has been in the past 70 years. And the state must recognize the diaspora as of equal value and an equally responsible co-builder and co-creator of all Jewish life.
Wow. By the way, when he says 70 years ago, he's writing the 1950s. Okay, so just put that in perspective. Wow, an equally responsible co-creator and co-builder of all Jewish life. That completely overturns the traditional Israeli sort of Zionist narrative. And here's what I want to suggest for us. We in Jewish professionals, we love to say that there's a paradigm shift. Yeah, the paradigms are shifting all the time. We love it. We love it. Yes, but I really do firmly believe that at this moment in time, while Israel is, I think, an unparalleled success story. And yes, at another session, I'm happy to go through all the really, really big challenges and problems, from the issue of religion and state to the issue of occupation and what are we doing with the Palestinians and like that whole thing. Huge, huge challenge. Okay, and that we might be living in perpetual conflict, for a very long time. However, the notion of building a Jewish state is an unparalleled success story, in my opinion. And yes, it is our job to support it, okay? And Bob continued to write those checks, okay, especially to the reform movement in Israel, okay, and do that. Yes, that is critically important. And by the way, one of the things I'm proud of, I know we have about a minute left. If Ariana, if we can go over 1 minute, I'll just give the punchline. One of the things I'm deeply proud of Israel is the highest, I don't know if you know this, the highest percentage per capita of NGOs or nonprofits. Everyone in Israel wakes up in the morning and says, how can I make society, make life better? Here, I'll found a nonprofit. And subsequently, a couple of years later, there will be the highest per capita rate of American friends of those nonprofit organizations, which again, we should all continue to support with great gusto and fervor. And but here's the thing. The question that I think we ought to ask today is, what do we have to offer from our experience? And what do we have to learn from the Israeli experience beyond our pocketbooks? And I want to suggest one thing, right? And if we were sitting in your building in West Bloomfield, Michigan, I would ask you to look around at everything you've created, but just look at what you've created this past week. Look at the community that you've built, a congregation of over 3,000 families with an incredible, incredible team and staff and professionals and rabbis and cantors and all those things. And let me ask you a question. Anybody serve on the board at all of the congregation here? Okay, well, just throw out if you guys, how much of your budget is supported by the government? Maybe you get a tax exempt status as a nonprofit, and maybe you got some PPP or Homeland Security. That's great, but by and large, nothing, right? So the model that we've created now is that we've been able to create vibrant, thriving, caring Jewish communities in a privatized economy where the government doesn't support our religious institutions. And I think it's time that we figure out how to export that model to Israel. Because Israel, two things. One is that Israelis are waking up to the reality that having a Jewish state doesn't necessarily mean having a Jewish community. And two, the challenge in Israel is that we are all competing for the public space. And so, you can, in Detroit, you can have several congregations on the same street, okay? And it's not as, maybe it's a little friendly competition, but everyone kind of does their own thing. And, there's conservative, there's Orthodox, and sometimes we share, sometimes we don't, sometimes whatever. In my neighborhood in Brooklyn, that's the case. And although let's not talk about COVID. And we see that a lot. Where I grew up in Skokie, Illinois, there were 5 congregations within a 2-block radius: Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, Traditional, whatever. And in Israel, they're all competing for the public space, and so it becomes dicey. But what I think we need to do is to say, what can we share of our experience in being co-creators of Jewish life, and share that with Israel. So when we talk about Israel and diaspora, I'm not talking on the AIPAC or J Street level of governmental relations and influencing, sort of foreign policy. That's important too. That's a critical discussion, especially when it comes to, what are we going to do with the geopolitical story right now, whether it's the Abraham Accords or Iran or whatever. I want to talk about us as a Jewish community, from Jew to Jew, from Jewish community in the two largest Jewish communities in the world, and how do we evolve the relationship to be mutually beneficial and really create a new and enriched Jewish life. And I'm happy to stay on and discuss questions. I apologize that and I just want to thank you all and remind you that those of you at Temple Israel who check that box that says Artza on your due statement, you are helping to build a reform, vibrant Jewish life in Israel, and to really change what it means to be Jewish in the Jewish state. And that's critically important. And we need that now more than ever with the challenges that we are facing. I'll just put my email in the chat here, and would love to be in touch with everyone.
Josh, thank you so much. I am gonna remove the spotlight and put us back to gallery view. I know that there was one question, maybe I'm gonna stop the recording. I'm gonna stop streaming to Facebook, but maybe if you can stick around to answer a question or two. But I so appreciate you being here and spending time with us. Thank you. You have clearly so much more to teach us. We would love to have you back again and make this a recurring thing. I think we all can really learn a lot.